Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Dark Pixel Podcast. My name is Mike.
I'm Landon.
I'm Kason.
And today, our guest is Emily Short. She is a writer and a game designer who specializes in interactive narrative, dialogue, and social interaction modeling. She's written more than 24 works of interactive fiction, including the award-winning Galatea. She's also the character engine product manager at Spirit AI, which is a tech company that develops artificial intelligence for the game industry. And she's here to talk to us today about new developments in artificial intelligence and the potential for utilizing AI within video games to make NPC interaction more meaningful. Thank you so much for being with us, Emily. Really appreciate it. I watched your talk at Game Lab, Barcelona last year. I thought it was absolutely fascinating, the work that you are doing. On our podcast in the past, we've talked quite a bit about video games as a storytelling medium and the potential for them. A lot of people will say that video games aren't quite there when talking about their how they're written and the kinds of stories that we're getting from video games when compared to other mediums. Yeah. And one way that I have thought that I guess video games could separate themselves or be unique as a storytelling medium is it's all with the interaction, right? So being able to actually speak, whether that's text to speech or whether that's typing in or whatever it is, speak to NPCs and have them interact with you in a unique way, different than from someone else who gave their own, sort of unique sort of input to that character. I am not a game designer, so maybe you can enlighten us a little bit on this, but it seems to me that a lot of research and development these days goes into graphics and animation, game mechanics to make killing more interesting and fun and exciting. But what I would like to see is more research done on the kinds of things that you are working on. So maybe you can fill us in a little bit on what it is exactly that you do at Spirit AI, and then what can be done to change, not necessarily get rid of what we're doing great now in games, but how can we bring more complex character interaction into games in a way that is marketable and profitable to be sort of like a defining feature for a game. Do you have any ideas on that?
Okay, well, that's it's a multi-part question, yes, but I'll start with what we're doing. So Character Engine grows out of experience that I have and other members of my team have of writing for many years interactive fiction and indie games and in some cases academic projects where we were really interested in digging into how do we make characters that feel more realistic, that seem to have a social context, that have a relationship to the player that goes beyond just kind of a single axis of friendly versus unfriendly. But then also, how do you make that kind of system something that can still be used for storytelling? So it's still authorable, it still stays on track, it doesn't do a kind of Microsoft K thing of just completely going off the rails and responding with strange responses. So that's what Character Engine is really about, is modeling what is the NPC thinking, what are they feeling about you, what is their emotional state, what kinds of social interactions are we in the middle of with them, but not modeling that as a kind of, it's not a full, like I'm trying to model everything that a human being possibly could experience. It's not that kind of general AI. It's very specific to the game and the scenario that you're in. And as an author, you're sort of defining the dimensions that are going to matter for your character in this particular story. So a story that was, kind of like a Tom Clancy-esque thriller might be about loyalty and patriotism and those kinds of things. And those might be the axes on which you're measuring your characters. A different type of story, if it's a romantic comedy, it might be about a totally different set of issues. So how do we sort of structure those things so that people can build simulations and mechanics that are going to work in a game context, but still have a lot of narrative around them. And then as a front end to that, Character Engine actually lets you plug in a couple of different kinds of character interactions. So you can, as you say, do speech to text or actual typed natural language input, and that's one approach. And if you do that, then what the system is doing is looking at a number of different aspects of the player input. So what can it detect about what you mean and what you're referring to in the game world? What can it see about the emotionality of what you just said? So if I say, hey, jerk, that's going to be a different response that's going to have than if I just said like a generic hello, right? So it's pulling multiple things out of the player input and then mapping those against the social situation that you're currently in and the narrative scene you're currently in and trying to find its best fit for how it can understand and respond to that. That's not the only way that you can use it. So the system is also capable of making menus at runtime. So instead of letting people type or speak, giving something that's a little bit more like a traditional dialogue wheel or a traditional type of game UI, but where the content of that is actually being populated at runtime based on what the interaction state is, so that the options for the protagonist are also being dynamically generated. And what that means is you have the opportunity, like you could imagine, like if you're playing in a role-playing game where you've been trying to play your protagonist as kind of, the hard-bitten cop or whatever, you might drive your player character to have different menu options than somebody else who was more, sort of playing a more fluffy character. So all of those kinds of pieces go into what we're building. In terms of how to bring that kind of thing into the larger industry, I think there are a couple of different things, and one of them is what we're trying to do right now, which is de-risk this technically a bit, right? Like have some tools that people can use, have some design examples, be able to go to a game company and say, here's an engine that does this, here's an authoring tool, here are debugging tools, here's, prior art that shows you about how long it takes to build something like this. And that all makes it a lot more palatable. I mean, the sort of part of the reason that, especially in the kind of AAA space, people don't want to go into this territory is because the budgets are so huge and the risks are so huge that, taking on something where you don't know, like, how long is it going to take me to build all this content? Is it even going to work? That's very challenging. So if you can take out some of the technical risk by having a tool set that is understood and has some predictable aspects to it, that makes things a lot easier. And then I think there are sort of two other aspects to it. One is kind of establishing more understanding around the design space. So it's a little bit of an issue with menu-driven conversation. It's very much an issue with natural language-driven conversation. There are a lot of things to learn about how to design a scene well if you're relying on the player to use natural language, because one of the things that I think isn't immediately obvious, but as soon as you sit down to actually write a game this way, it becomes completely like crystal clear how much storytelling we actually do through the choices that we give to the player to speak, right? So if you've got those options on your screen, you've got things that are defining the protagonist, they're clarifying what as a player you're allowed to do or not do in this game. So there's a lot that you're kind of giving to the player as like a framework for their interaction that way. And if you don't have that, if you're saying like, okay, player, say whatever you want, that suddenly like you've put a significant challenge in front of them, and also you've lost part of how you communicate to them. And there are other things that you gain from that, but it is just a different design space. So having more examples, more work written in that way, and also kind of building up some player literacy about, well, here's how you even play this kind of thing. And I think those are the other kinds of things that need to be solved for in order to make this its own genre. Now, I'm very keen to see that happen, obviously, but I think it's not a trivial set of things.
Yeah, that's interesting you bring that up, because I find myself, there's Alexa, there's Google, whatever Google's thing's called. You can talk to now, and I find that I don't utilize those until I am informed that, oh, you could say this. And then I'm like, Oh, okay. So
like, tell it this joke.
Google sends emails like on a weekly basis for their voice actions, essentially, to inform people like, hey, you could tell it to do this and that. And it's funny, but it plays into exactly what you're talking about. It's like the team made a choice. It's like I could make any choice, and then I'm paralyzed, so I don't make any choice at all. I just don't even use the feature. Like, I don't use the voice communicating type features on my phone that much, because I'm just like, I'm just going to do what I know, and I'm going to type something into Google search instead of hope that if I say, hey, schedule an appointment for whatever, that it actually knows to do that. 'Cause there's nothing worse. Risky. There's nothing worse than where the technology stands right now than feeling like something should have worked and then it didn't work, and you kind of feel dumb. You know, you're kind of like, okay, all right, I'm just not going to use this then if it's not all there. You know what I mean? That's where I find myself.
Well, because you don't know, the boundaries are fuzzy. You don't know the extent to which you can push it or to which it can respond or understand you.
Yeah.
So I think
like teenage phase with that.
Teenage phase.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, I think there are a lot of things around sort of building the UI to make it a little bit clearer, you know, what the system is even understanding from moment to moment. So one of the demos that we built, and this is more recently than the robot demo that I had images of, so I don't think you guys will have seen this, but we built a more recent demo, which was at this past GDC, where on one side of the screen you see the character that you're speaking to, and then next to that character you actually see a readout that's kind of it's a bit like that display in Westworld where there's a panel where it's sort of showing why the character is picking what they're picking. So at the top of that you see, like, here is what, like, the things that they picked up from what you said to them, like, I understood that was insulting, and I understood that you mentioned my mom, you know, that kind of thing. And then underneath that, there's like, you actually get a dialogue, it's not a dialogue tree in the conventional sense. So you get a diagram of how they're building out their sentence word by word and why they're picking those words. And kind of, you know, and sometimes it's, here's my response to what you just said, and now I've got a transition to picking up what I want to say to move the narrative forward. So you can kind of see all of that being built out. Now, I'm not saying that, like, every game interaction that we would have with this kind of character, you would actually want all of that kind of information, but there are ways to kind of give people a little bit more understanding of, like, okay, this is what you just did. Like, the action that you just performed, like, here's what was understood from it. And so then that's reinforcing.
That reminds me of kind of like in the Civilization games when you're speaking with a leader, and they'll usually have something where it's like they hate you for these reasons, and they like, you know, these are the interactions that contributed to something, and that's definitely helpful.
That's helpful.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing that we pick up with other people in terms of body language or eye contact or facial cues or hand gestures or whatever. Or if you're talking to someone on the phone, then their tone of voice. We can pick up on how well they understood what we just told them. AI just doesn't have that yet, and there's no way for us to really gauge whether you got through to someone.
Well, and I mean, the thing is that often it's intentionally obfuscating whether it understood you or not, right? Like, it's trying to look like it understood everything. So if it didn't understand, it'll give you something. So there's kind of this challenge of, like, you don't want to completely set aside those smoke and mirrors tricks, because they are very useful at times, but you, especially in a game context, I think one of the other important points here is that a game with this is very different from Alexa or Siri or something, because, you know, on the one hand, you're not trying to make an airline ticket purchase or anything like that. So in a sense, the stakes are lower, but in another sense, there's a lot more sort of potential emotionality there. Like, ideally, Alexa probably isn't gonna, like, be begging you to save her daughter from invading soldiers or whatever, but, like, those kinds of things would arise in a game, right? So,
that's true.
So there's a bunch of other kind of stuff that comes into play in the game context that kind of lets you pick from the player input. Like, if it's like, I didn't understand exactly what you said, but I didn't feel like, you know, you came across as angry, so I'm going to respond to your emotional state. Like, there are some things you can do like that, but the important thing is you do want the player to remain kind of aware of, like, what is the general realm of things that I could do that would be meaningful to this character, because otherwise they're just, you know, it's just disconnect and not satisfying.
Yeah, that makes sense.
One thing I wanted to ask about in terms of trying to get larger developers and studios to sort of, like, accept the kind of what you guys are making and what you're trying to bring to them. What does space limitation, like how does that factor into it? Like how much space does it take to have a complex AI like this?
Yeah.
How large are we talking about in terms of like file size to try and put something like this into the game?
Well, so I mean, a lot of the assets that we're working with, I mean, you say audio is small. A lot of what we're working with is text, right?
Oh,
so that in itself is comparatively lightweight. And if you're doing something that is text to speech, and that's its own whole interesting subject area, but that means that if you're doing that in a way that you're satisfied with, you get rid of the need to have all of those lines voiced. So that actually opens up some space. So you might have, I've got many more possible lines of dialogue to be spoken, but actually the amount of space that that's taking up is less than it would have been otherwise. And when you get into some of the way that our text generation system works, it's recombining elements. And that means that you can get out of, sort of a couple of months of writer time, or less than that even, you can get sort of millions of lines of possible combinations because of the combinatorics of that. But because of the way that it's being stored, it's not actually just ballooning your content out endlessly because it's all, the pieces are all indexed and you're generating in real time.
So what would it take, or how far away are we to where an NPC player can be, or an NPC can be voiced and also have this kind of procedurally generated text response?
With a voiceover?
Yeah, well, yeah.
No,
like go ahead.
Okay, so I mean, obviously, if you mean like have an actor,
well, that would
read
possible,
all the variant
right?
lines. Well, exactly, right. I mean, like, it's like, here are n million variant versions of these lines. Like,
Sure.
Nobody would have the patience for that. So the tech on this is, so I mean, if you're asking about sort of text to speech, the tech on this is moving incredibly rapidly right now. So if you look at what has been done with WaveNet, some of the deep learning based speech generation has come enormously along in the last 12 to 18 months. And it's kind of a thing where there's something awesome and new every few months if you look at what's going on. The current challenges are, so some of the most recent sort of examples that came out of Google, for instance, like they've got a bunch of samples where if you listen to them, it genuinely is difficult to tell whether that is a human being speaking or not. It does not sound like a train conductor fake voice. It sounds like a human. So that's amazing. The things that still need to be dealt with, but it's a kind of thing where you can see where we're going. So the trajectory is, it's going to resolve this. There's emotionality. So how do you capture not just like I am a news announcer reading this line aloud and I sound like a human being, but I don't sound like I have feelings about it. How do you get from there to something that actually captures the kind of performance that you get out of an actor? So there are challenges around that, and some of that has to do with doing enough different models of the voice. So basically, I don't know, how much technical detail are you interested in? I can go into like the longer or the shorter explanation here, depending.
Well, tell us, will voice actors even be a thing in 10 years?
I think they will. But one of the, it may be a thing where as a voice actor, what you're doing is you're going in and you're recording a huge number of samples, and then your samples are being used to train. Exactly, and then that's being used to train.
Adobe's been doing that.
Yeah, so I've seen Adobe. They released, what was it, last year or something, some sort of demonstration of that. Is that so? You're saying that's much further along than people think.
So the two things are emotionality and being able to do all of this in real time, right? So a lot of the things that you can hear on Google right now are, produced at, like, take long enough that you couldn't run that in a game yet.
Sure. Okay.
But yeah, it is moving really fast. So the kind of interesting things, like at Spirit, we're not trying to solve that problem ourselves because people with a lot more money then we are working on it, and we'll just let them do that. But what we're trying to do is make Character Engine able to plug into that technology as it comes online. So right now with Character Engine, if you want to, you can say like everything here needs to be voiceover, and I'm just going to use much less procedural generation in the text, and we're going to keep this simple. So that's an option. But another, if the other thing that we're trying to do is build up sort of intelligent emotional tagging for the lines that are generated. So things like automating if the character is feeling a little bit hesitant right now and I want to put that into the line, I might put a little pause at the beginning or a little indrawn breath, or I might tag a piece of the line as being more emphatic. And having all of that kind of metadata alongside the line of dialogue itself is what's going to let you drive that kind of more emotive performance as the tool set comes along. So we're doing some other R&D in that space, but then we start to get into NDA territory, so I'll stop on that part.
What would the possibility be of just taking a system like this? Mike mentioned how big this would have to be to fit in an actual game, but what if we kind of left it in the cloud computing space, and as long as you're connected to this is a game, you have to be connected to the internet to play.
Right.
And is that something that would be maybe more realistic?
That's also very doable. So yeah, I mean, we're developing for both of those possible applications. So the ability to have something that is cloud-based or the ability to have something that's device-based. The scope of what you need to accommodate obviously is you need a lot less content if you're doing something that is dynamic menu driven, where the system is making suggestions for the player. If you have something that's natural language driven, then the range of sort of material that you probably need to cover is just larger because you've got more potential inputs from the player that you need to accommodate, right? But the flip side of that is with some of the generative text stuff, you can take a database of information and have the NPC be able to deliver answers based on that in a way that's it's actually just generating that. And that means you can do things like, kind of load new content into that database for the dialogue to be generated from at different points in the game, or bring things in, if characters are doing something in an MMO that you want to remember and refer back to later. So you can actually be sort of changing that database of knowledge over time, and then have the characters speak about it without having individually authored every single line about that.
So how would the ESRB rate a game? Where the computers can't say anything.
It can no. I mean, this is very important. It cannot say anything, right? Like, it's not learning from players in real time in the way that some of the, I mentioned Tay earlier, like they're, kind of things that are sort of pulling in input. Like, and you could imagine why you wouldn't want this, right? Like you go to an MMO and there's a bartender, and over time, like he turns into this like horrible Nazi or something. It'd be awful.
Someone brings Hitler into the equation, and it's like,
right, and it's just like you just ruined everything.
Doesn't understand political practice.
So yeah, I mean, obviously, what we're trying to do is support something that is really dynamic and responsive, but remains within the realm of what the author of the game wanted, meaning that like it's not going to start seeding in any content that isn't either in the database that you're building and you control what you're putting in that database, or in the authored content that you created. So if so you control the gates on that, right? And then the place where we're bringing a little bit more kind of machine learning and computational creativity is actually into the natural language understanding, and then into the authoring tool. So the authoring tool, and this is something that's still coming along, but the authoring tool can do things like suggest, like, you have this word in here, maybe you want to understand these synonyms, or maybe you want to do these other things. So having some of the AI be directed towards helping you create that content, but then once the content is created, it's not going to just do things that you didn't anticipate. In that sense.
Very, very, very fascinating stuff. I seriously, like, I am so into this because I really feel like this is sort of the next step in terms of storytelling, unique storytelling for video games.
I think so. Have you played, do you play many games?
I play a lot of games. I don't play. I mean, there's a lot that I don't play because, I mean, who has time to do everything? But
Yeah.
Right.
yeah.
Well, I had a question pertaining to that, but I think you wanted to say something about Mike talking about stories.
Oh, all I was going to say was, I came into the AI from storytelling in the first place, right? Like I was interested in doing certain kinds of interactive narrative and increasingly realized that in order to make that experience that I wanted to make, I needed it to be more and more procedural. So it wasn't like I sort of came at it from an engineering perspective first. It was sort of like, all right, well, I need to keep learning this extra stuff in order to do what I want to do for the player.
Yeah.
Right. So what went wrong with Mass Effect Andromeda?
No, that I can't speak to. Sorry.
Okay. I wonder if you had a perspective on that.
Okay. So you just talked about how you had come into AI from a storytelling perspective first, right?
Yeah.
You spoke a little bit in your Game Lab talk about a response you got from a player concerning your game Galatea.
Mm-hmm.
How I guess they felt about an NPC interaction. It really made them feel deeply.
Mm-hmm.
So taking that into consideration, first of all, if you'd like to share that experience, that'd be great. But okay, just go ahead. Maybe we'll do that so the audience has context. We should do that first, so the audience.
Okay, so I mean, this is not like a huge long story. It was just that there are things that you can say in that game. So it's a parser based text adventure where you can type things like ask this character about a topic or tell her about a topic. And there are certain things that you find out that she actually doesn't know. You can tell her about that are going to hurt her feelings. And so a player was playing through this scene and had an experience they wrote to me about and said, this is the first time that I was playing a game and I felt like I should apologize to a character. And I actually typed sorry and she understood me. And so that was like, I thought that kind of encapsulated something about the experience that I want to be able to create again for people, is that sort of sense of this is an interaction with a character that has some kind of interiority. They are not just somebody who's in my way or somebody who's giving me a fetch quest. They're not a utilitarian thing. And therefore the interaction that I can have with them could potentially have these dramatic nuances. They could get into sort of issues of human connection and, how we actually feel about other people, which from my point of view is where all of the really interesting stories are.
Wow, yeah, that's absolutely very cool.
Yeah, I love that. I love that, by the way, that story. That's exactly what I've always seen as like the reason I stick around, the reason I love the industry and the reason why I love games is because as much as I love to read novels, as much as I love filmmaking, we've done a lot of filmmaking in our group. That's kind of how we started out on YouTube. Video games provide the opportunity for me to participate potentially. And of course, there's many hurdles to get to the point where we have the presentation of games the way they are now, but also implementing the type of character interaction that you have been able to create for people. So, taking that experience into consideration, let's see, what kind of progress is being made towards making that a reality in a large-scale game? Say something like The Elder Scrolls or some kind of large role-playing game. How much progress is being made, and how far are we off from seeing something like that implemented?
Well, I think this ties into, a lot of the things that I was just saying about, how do systems like this become productively available to large scale engines in general. But there's also a writing component. And I think, part of it is, do we have a system that is sophisticated enough to generalize about the point of, you just said something to this character that ought to hurt their feelings, and therefore we're now in a space where they're going to have a reaction, and it would be socially appropriate to apologize. And if you apologize, there should be another reaction. Like that kind of generalization. That's a piece of it. But the other piece of it is around kind of learning to set up the backstory and the nuance of that character and the world that they're embedded in such a way that you actually believe that there's something at stake there. And that's an area where I think, we've seen progress in kind of different areas of the industry, but Telltale has done some things where with sort of some of their work more than others, but in some cases where people really sort of felt like, oh, this is making an impact on this character. So kind of getting to understand how to write the material surrounding those moments of choice is another important piece of it. So I think both of those things come into play. Can we like put these characters in situations that are believably significant to the player? And sometimes counterintuitively, I think that means ratcheting the scenario down rather than up. Like, I think sometimes we have an instinct to go really big with the like, oh, the fate of the world is at stake, or dragons are going to raise the entire land or whatever. And the thing is that like that is so far out of the scope of anybody's normal life that it's kind of hard to connect to sometimes. And some of the most kind of emotionally affecting moments that I've experienced in games have been about things that are smaller but more personal than that. So it's not about like, is my town going to be destroyed? It's about like, I really want this person to like me and I just found out they don't, and it sucks. So it's like,
right.
Yeah, I've actually had that conversation with some of the people in our audience. We play a lot of RPGs on this channel, and the scale seems to always try to increase and increase and increase, and it goes from saving the world to killing God in every single iteration. How can we make that even more crazy? And there have been a few games that we've played that try to do something on a much smaller scale. This is just within this province or region or country or something like that. Yeah. And those to me it's a big breath of fresh air. It's just like, like I can actually identify with some of these themes. It actually feels more real and grounded. And so I totally agree with that point. I'd love to see that a lot more. Did you have something you were going to say, Kaysen?
I was just thinking, a thought that came to my mind as you were kind of mentioning all this is maybe every character doesn't have, like, I think one of the most difficult things and what people want to see and what Mass Effect Andromeda tried to do was you have just like 100 characters in the game and you need all of them to have this infinite dialogue tree. And it's really difficult to do it when it's everyone involved. But it's possible with what you were talking about earlier, that you could just have a couple people, maybe someone in your party or maybe someone you're really close to, and he's the person who you can talk to about anything. But for everybody else, as far as world building goes, there is a script, there is a story, it goes a certain direction. Maybe not for everybody else, but you don't have to do this for everyone. You could just maybe have this for the people you're closest to, or the people that you as a game director would want the players to connect the most with.
Yeah, no, that's certainly possible. And the other way to go with this is, to have a bunch of lower level characters that you can speak to in a fairly free-form way, but they're drawing on a kind of, they have this shared database of information about the world that is, most of their responses are kind of drawn on that. And then they've got a little bit of sort of trait-based personalization of, guard speaks differently from a farmer or whatever. But they're not as sort of finely tuned as your best friend.
As the people you talk to the most, right? And exactly. And I guess the scaling there would probably be what's most important.
Yeah.
So another part of your talk I found very, very fascinating. You were talking about Versu. Before we jump into the question, do you want to explain what the project is? What is Versu?
Yeah, so this is a project that I worked on several years back now. So basically, my career has been sort of obsessively trying to work on this problem from different angles, right? So writing different games and writing different systems, trying to like tackle this in different ways. And Versu is sort of a systematic attempt that I was working on a few years back with Richard Evans, who was the lead AI designer on Sims 3. He has a lot of experience with modeling sort of autonomous characters. And he had this idea of, instead of modeling a world where it's all about, you know, kind of just what are the physical objects in this world, what if the primary thing that we're modeling in the world is social practices that you're part of? So by social practice, I mean things like having a conversation as a social practice, dancing with somebody as a social practice, having dinner with somebody as a social practice. There are scenarios where they're kind of understood things that are appropriate for people to do within that scenario. And then, like, those are the only things that we're worried about modeling, because in practice, most of the time, like, there's a wide range of things that I could do at this moment, but the only ones that sort of socially make any sense are the ones that belong to, you know, the social practice of participating in a podcast, right? Right. So basically, what Versu is doing is letting you define kind of, here's this library of social practices that say, like, at different points in this interaction, what can people who are doing this kind of interaction reasonably do? And then making those options available to both the player and all of the NPCs. So it was actually agnostic about whether somebody was a player character or a non-player character initially. So then the non-player characters are scoring, like, out of all the things that I could do right now, which one most fits my desires, and I'll pick to do that one. And then the player is just given their list of options. So yeah, so it was very kind of socially oriented gameplay.
So one thing that you talked about that you found was that NPCs would sometimes be more interested in their conversations with each other or with what they're doing, and would acknowledge the player if they came and introduced themselves or something, but would not necessarily be engaged with talking to the player, right? Yeah. And that the feedback to that was that players did not like that. They did not accept that. They thought it was unrealistic. Right. Why do you think that is?
So I think there are a couple of things going on here. So we had, just to sort of ground this a little bit more, like, we had done a lot of reading about conversational pragmatics, like actual studies by people looking at how conversation flow happens in real life, and like what determines turn taking and who gets to speak next and who pays attention to whom and all that kind of stuff. And one of the things that we had built into our system was the idea that characters are more likely to pay attention to other characters that they have an emotional investment in. Which meant that if you came into a room where, like, there's a boyfriend and girlfriend talking to each other and you try to have a conversation with them, they might just kind of like say hi and then go back to talking to each other mostly, which is a thing that happens in real life all the time. Sure. But players reported that as buggy and unrealistic. And when we changed the scoring system internally to make the NPCs prefer to respond to players, we then got the feedback, oh, this is much more realistic. So I think there are a couple of interesting things here. One is, like, obviously it's not more realistic. We made it less realistic in order to make players comfortable. That doesn't mean that the players were wrong to request that. I think there's an important distinction here that I think you have to bear in mind whenever you're trying to design this kind of system, which is that in addition to the relationship that the player has with the NPCs, there's the conversation the player is having with the game. And it's important for them never to feel like the game has stopped paying attention to them, even if the NPCs have stopped paying attention to them. So what we were doing wrong there was not communicating to the player, oh yeah, I see you, but they're just ignoring you. So I think it would have felt less buggy to people if the system had said something like, you know, oh, Jane is like too wrapped up in Brandon to like answer you right now, or something like that. Then that would have felt like, you know, all right, it is realistic. I'm getting that information. Because the player wasn't getting information about what was going on in the NPC's mind, that felt weird to them and unsatisfactory. The other thing here is just, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just thought that was really funny. Keep going.
Sorry, I tend to monologue. So
no, you can keep going.
Break this up into pieces. So the other part, though, about that is that you always need to listen to players when they tell you they're not having a good experience. What they tell you is the reason they're not having a good experience or what you should do about it is usually wrong. So that's like just in my experience, like, yes, they definitely aren't, they're like, what's happening is not what they want to have happen, and they're accurate about that, but it's not realistic was not the problem. So
Do you think there's something like an uncanny valley of sorts when it comes to realism, but with maybe audio, with dialogue, with the kinds of things that you're working on?
Yeah.
Where when things become too realistic, people
are
I don't know.
repulsed by
People,
it.
yeah, they're repulsed by it. They think I should be able to read someone's mind. No one can read anyone's mind, but we're so used to that now, and it's so simplistic that when you try to become more complex about it, people kind of freak out. Do you think that kind of plays into it?
I mean, I don't think that was the issue with the Versu stuff, because we were not doing nearly as much text generation. It was authored lines, and it was being presented in text. So it was not kind of going into that kind of territory of somebody sounding human but not human in quite the way that you're talking about, I think.
Okay, right.
But I think there is, yeah.
Even though it's text based, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there definitely is a thing where another thing I often say in this context is it's not worth putting AI into the game unless the game is going to be able to explain that, like the workings of that AI to the player at some level. So what I mean by that is there's another thing, which I can't remember actually whether I brought up, but did I, in the Game Lab talk, did I talk about the bug with the character who disliked the player?
I don't remember that. I don't remember that.
Okay. So this was something that came up when we were playtesting. Richard was playtesting a scene where he had dinner with some characters, and then he went into another scene of the story and met a character who had not been there during the dinner scene, and that character was really rude to him, like as the first sort of interaction that they had. And Richard was like, well, like, what is going on here? This must be broken. Like, I'm not supposed to have a negative relationship with this character yet. Well, what had actually happened, like when he went back and through the trace of events in the log, was one of the other characters had formed a negative impression of him during dinner and then gone off and gossiped to this character before the other character ever even met him. So the other characters like came into the room already like having heard a bad reputation about the player character, and therefore like was unpleasant. And so it wasn't,
you get too realistic, and this happens in real life, but people don't expect it to happen in a game.
Right. So I mean, this is exactly it though, right? Because if you're playing a game and something happens where you can't figure out why it happened, then it just feels like there's a glitch here, right? I don't trust this. Whereas it happens in real life, and you're like, well, I don't understand, but there must be a reason. So yeah, I mean, it was a perfect example of something where like actually that behavior was really interesting, but because we had no way of communicating that to the player, it kind of sucked as an experience. But if we had a way for if like that character had come in and been like, oh, I already heard about you from George, heard what you did at dinner, you're kind of a jerk, then that would have been a satisfying interaction. Or if there had been any other way for that information to reach the player, it would have been okay. But it was the fact that it wasn't.
Maybe if the character had been unpleasant, but then somebody with you had been like, oh, he must have been talking to this person who's been spreading rumors about you or something like that, right? To inform.
But you don't want the game to explain everything, do you?
Well, that's
no. But you need to.
That's stuff that I've read studies about. For example, shooters where the enemies will say what they're about to do. Because if they don't, oftentimes the player interprets that as unfair, or because they know that the game holds all the cards, and it's very easy for the player to be like, the game cheated because it controls everything, and I'm this helpless human. Oh, yeah. And so you need to skew it so that people don't think the game is screwing them over, more or less. I feel like so.
I used to think that I played the N64, and I'd be like when Link battles Dark Link in Ocarina of Time. And Dark Link basically mimics every move you're going to do. It's as if he knows what you're doing. And I'm just like, that's the game that knows what I'm doing. That's not fair. I push A, and then the defender reacts, not,
And that's like the default state of humans. I feel like going into a lot of these games is that if you're not succeeding, that sometimes there's something wrong with the game, or if
it's not giving you a fair
chance. In what I was reading, they had the enemies say a flanking or whatever, and then when people heard they were flanking, they knew they were flanking, and when they got shot in that direction, it was like, oh, that was fair. Even though that's
we're kind of like weather in
makes no sense at all.
It's like there's technically a little forecast down there, but sometimes you're not paying attention. It rains, and you think it's unfair, but it was there, and so you can still kind of blame yourself.
Yeah.
Well, along these lines, maybe I'm an outlier in this, but when I play AAA games, which are, I mean, built to be power fantasies, essentially, right? But when I'm walking around and every single person that I pass has to say something to me, it becomes really, really annoying. In Skyrim, especially when you go to Whiterun, I think it is, one of the major like central villages there. There's a guy who passes you right when you walk in the door every time who says the same condescending remark about, have you been to this wealthier district over here? Oh, of course you haven't. And he repeats that every time you go back to the village. And like every time you pass someone else, they have to turn to you and say something to you. And that to me feels incredibly unrealistic. I would rather have them say nothing at all or say their condescending comment one time and then never say it again. Never speak to me ever again. Then have them repeat and have them interact with me all the time. So what do you think the balance is after your experience with Versu and the feedback you got between what you had originally done there, which was a realistic social interaction, and then what Skyrim does, which is just annoying to me? What's the best way to balance that?
Well, I think there are a couple of sort of design pieces that come into this, where it's also there's an important difference of scale between Skyrim and Versu, because we were doing projects where it would take you between 30 minutes and 2 hours to play. It was not a Skyrim scale experience. What that means from an NPC point of view is like maybe you haven't been to that town with the condescending guy who gives you the clue to go to this district for 3 weeks and you forgot about the clue. Sure. So there's a kind of game design reason why you might need that kind of thing seated in there. So I think I can understand why sometimes that repetition is baked in, but it's not about realism or even about sort of player acknowledgement. It's about kind of signposting things. But I think there are a couple of things that we can do to improve on that. One is just like much more variance in the lines that are actually produced. So if you have a generative system, they're not going to say verbatim the same words. They're going to say slightly different words, which might change up over time. And as you get a different reputation, he might become less snarky and more respectful or something, you know? So there's that. The other piece is around how do we let the players have better ways to ask when they're lost. So the ability to ask questions, and this kind of gets back to having non-player characters that have knowledge about the world that comes in a kind of database format, where you can ask things about like, oh, what's over there, and they can formulate an answer for you. So that becomes less about the game has to always be the one pushing that to the player, and maybe the player has a little bit more room to query things like that. So that can help. And then the other piece is just about like the sort of looking at what the player has actually done in the game so far and having that kind of sense of what's appropriate. If you haven't started this game up for months and you've probably forgotten things, that might put it in a different mode than, oh yeah, you were playing it yesterday and you were just in this town. So maybe
then it could decide to lead you on about certain things that maybe it had previously stopped doing if you had been playing yesterday. That makes sense.
But there's also sort of play style stuff that come into that as well. You've got, it's like, especially in MMOs, you've got some people who really just want to go do all the quests, and they're very impatient with a long conversation about lore. And there are other people who just really do want to hear all about like the Hall of the Mountain Elves or whatever. And so like if you pick up over time what kind of player this is, you could have the NPC give the longer or shorter explanation, which is what a human being would do too, right? Like if you seem not interested in hearing the saga of my countrymen, then I might not tell you it. So
that is also a very interesting topic. You went into that a little bit in your Game Lab talk as well. If anybody's interested in listening to that Game Lab talk, by the way, the link will be in the description. I totally suggest everybody watch it because it was great. Let's talk about Character Engine for a second. There was a demo that your team created with a like a robot character that was being the player is meant to interrogate regarding a murder or something along those lines.
Yeah, that's right.
And if I'm correct, the player types in those questions, and then the AI character will respond procedurally to whatever the player has put in. So with AI able to interpret incoming speech and react to it with improvisational or procedurally generated responses, what kind of challenges are writers going to face when creating their stories and directing the players, right? Because for anybody who's ever done a D&D campaign, especially if you've been a dungeon master, you prepare all week long. You think through as many scenarios as possible. You create all this stuff, and then some player does something you don't expect, and they roll a natural 20, and you have to let them succeed at that thing. And so you have to start changing your story kind of on the fly, right?
Yep.
How do you account for that sort of thing in game design and control for it?
Right. So a very important distinction is that what we're building for is talking to characters and not talking to a game master. And that's quite important because people are not saying like, this is what I want to have happen. I'm going to, cast Fireball Smite right now, but I'm going to cast it on that inn, and it's going to completely destroy the next quest I was supposed to go on. You're talking to characters. Characters have an agenda. Characters are in a scene at the moment, so sort of interactions that you have are divided up into scenes where the scene says who's participating in this interaction, what kinds of what things could happen that would bring about the end of the scene. I'm going to move on to a new piece of the story whenever I found out a critical piece of information, or I've answered your question about joining a quest or not, or we've become friends, or, there could be lots of different ways that a scene could conclude, but there is that kind of structure. And then within a scene, there are ways for the NPC to bring things back on track and kind of say, okay, well, I'm done talking about the weather now. Let's get back to this question of whether you're going to go fight the dragon. And so the design there is giving the author the ability to kind of make this scaffolding of, these are the things that need to be communicated to the player in the course of this scene. These are the ways that the scene is allowed to productively end. And then the system, the engine, is going to remix that. So it might be, I've written a way for this NPC to pitch the quest to you, but I've made that able to vary a bit depending on how they're feeling about you. So the exact way that they phrase it is going to be dependent on kind of the decisions that the AI makes in the moment. But it's still within this kind of narrative structure that, as an author, I've built. And having that, especially the kind of NPC redirect, means that you can kind of have interactions with characters where they spend a while talking about something else or asking questions. So something I think is quite interesting about this is the possibility of having an NPC say, oh, would you go fight this dragon for me? And you could say, well, I don't know. It depends. Like, is the dragon, does he breathe fire? And so like actually kind of get a bit more backstory before you commit. But it's still kind of within this scaffolding.
Sure.
I think I've used that word before, but
yeah, you're fine. This is digging a little bit into a question that one of our audience members asked a little later about idleness, player idleness. But stepping away from the idleness aspect of it, like how do you redirect a player when they're saying something? Because you know what people are going to do. Some people like me are going to play very well into how they're being directed through what they're receiving from the NPCs. I'm going to talk to them about the topic at hand. But there are some players, some people that I know who want to test the boundaries and
of course,
just
and
go crazy.
And that's part of the fun,
So how do you direct a player who's trying to off-rail a conversation or say something completely out of context, or like, how do you account for that with the AI sort of responding and sort of trying to get the player back on track with the conversation without feeling like maybe you're being condescending to them? You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, the thing is, okay, so two things. One is that this sort of gets into a broader piece of design experience, but the areas that I typically find most necessary to cover thoroughly from a point of view of creating content are, what are the things that I communicated to the player that they should do? And then also, what are the things I communicated they should not do? Because they're going to be like the polar opposite of what they should do is what some people are going to do to be perverse. And then like there's other stuff that some people will try. But like sometimes you can kind of anticipate some of the negative territory as well as the positive territory, which is helpful. But then for the rest of it, it kind of falls back to the NPC has an agenda in this interaction, right? Like if I came to your house for dinner and I just started talking like just gibberish, you would not, like there would only be so many interactions where you would try to answer the gibberish, and then you'd be like, are you feeling okay? Like what is wrong with you, right? I mean, because at some point like you're Yeah,
I think this is funny because Mike brought up two scenarios which I think are super realistic, but there's a third scenario which I think the programmers or possibly people like you are wanting to go for that I don't think very many people are going to do. And I think gamers have a tendency to not treat people in games as people, but as objects or as a means to an end. Like if I walk up to this person, push A, they're going to tell me something important, right? And not seeing them as a person is, I think, a huge, what do you call it? Roadblock.
Barrier?
Barrier in what AI is trying to do. You could have a fluid conversation with somebody as if they're an actual person. How cool is that? Yeah, but I just want to know how to get to the castle. Or like Mike said, I'm just going to try and get you to say something stupid and laugh. Or, there are very few people who are going to be like, oh, this is a person. Let's have a friendly conversation. And that, I think that is going to be the hardest thing to get over. Like gamers don't see NPCs as anything but objects. I think it might be very difficult to get them to see them as anything else.
No, this is really interesting area, and it's really important. And it's something where like I agree with you. But I think this gets into design rather than tech. But it's really important. So the design answer here is that it needs to be interesting to model the interiority of that person, because the mechanics of how you treat them matter, right? So a conversation needs to become gameplay in a way where it's actually like, you are making kind of gamerly decisions about, am I going to answer this question or am I going to refuse? If I refuse, is he going to beat me up? Am I going to threaten him? Or is that like, do I want to escalate the stakes here or not? So what you want is a system where the structure of it is mechanically deep enough. You go beyond that kind of, lots of games have sort of Fable style, or that was even, I think, brought up in one of the questions that you sent me, Fable style mechanics, or mechanics where, it's like, I need to bring you, 50 gold pieces worth of gifts and then you'll like me, right? And that's a tedious mechanic and who cares, right? But if it's about like, I'm in the situation where you could do what I want or not, but I don't know how, like, I'm trying to gauge exactly how far I should push you. Should I be violent? Should I be flattering? And in order to make those decisions, I have to be thinking about what you think and what you know. And suddenly that becomes actually part of the gameplay. So I don't think it's like I'm going to persuade players to be nice just because they should be nice, like morally. Like that would be cool. But I don't think, I think that the game actually needs to be an interesting gameplay in that way. And a lot of why Character Engine is interesting to me, both the natural language side and actually the dynamic menu side as well, because we can build options for people to speak that nobody would have time to write in a conventional dialogue writing kind of context. It's all about player expressivity, right? Like if you are in a sort of conventional scene and you have 3 options, which are like, or maybe just 2 options, I've got the Paragon and the Renegade way of interacting with you, right? And that's it. And I can't do the like, well, I'm going along with you for now, but actually I don't really trust you kind of response. But how interesting wouldn't it, wouldn't that be interesting if you could kind of hedge your bets like that?
So you seem less interested in getting people to see them as people. It's like, okay, they're a means to an end. They're a mechanism to get the player what they want. But how the player gets what they want is going to be what's going to vary greatly, in this interaction, right? That's more or less.
Well, I mean, but part of the, like, basically the mechanics of that become about seeing them as a person in a certain way. Like, it may be, there may be sort of a puzzle box aspect of it, but it is gameplay about sort of human interactions rather than gameplay about the physics of bullet trajectories or whatever.
And in that sense, yeah, having a dialogue becomes part of the gameplay. I think that's really cool.
So, one thing that we've talked about before in the past as well is tutorial design, which tends to be very, very heavy in RPGs. But something like, let's say, in Mario, that's a lot simpler game. They teach you mechanically with the powers that you get and stuff about how to play this game very, very early. Yep. And then you use that knowledge, that experience for the rest of the game. Would you say that the answer to this problem that Kaysen is bringing up is to provide a scenario early on where maybe there is a heavy consequence for trying to use an NPC in a way to treating it as an object rather than a person or something like that? So say the NPC has something important, whether that's an item or information that the player needs. And if you treat them badly, they will stop talking to you. And whether that leads to a game over or whether that just means now you have to find some other way and it makes the game harder, is that maybe a method of design or something early on that can then set the player in the right mind for the rest of the game about how they're going to treat these NPCs and whether they're going to treat them more like real people?
Yeah, I mean, I think you definitely need elements like that, both to sort of establish that baseline fact of people are not going to respond well to being, kind of treated poorly. But then also, what does this game even understand as treating somebody well versus poorly? Like, do we have rules of politeness in this world? Like, should I be saying please and thank you? Do I have the ability to threaten people or bribe people or, so all of those things, which might, we don't with Character Engine prescribe, like, you can only do these or those things. Like, this is going to vary on a game-by-game basis, but those kinds of elements are things that the player would need to be taught so that they would understand, and ideally, taught with a light touch, but, kind of get to the point where, maybe in this game there's a lot of political intrigue and my secrets that I've learned become essentially like a kind of inventory that I can bring into conversations to, like, influence people in different ways or whatever. But I need to understand that. I need to understand, like, the value of those elements and how I can deploy them if they're going to be mechanically important in that way.
I actually have a thought about that, Mike. In the Legend of Zelda games, you go into somebody else's house and you break all of their pots, right? That's what you do in Zelda. But all of a sudden in Wind Waker, the first city you go to Windfall Island, you go up to the auction house, and he's got the really nice vases, right? And you're like, oh man, there's got to be good stuff in these. So you go and you break it, right? So I think the first, like, pot in someone's house that you essentially see in the game. I don't know if there's any on Outside Island. There's only a couple houses there, but you go and break it, and immediately the owner of the house is like, "What are you doing? You owe me money for that vase," and you end up having to pay to replace his vase, right? And from that point forward, it's like, oh, I can't just break things in people's houses now. Like, it kind of grounds you. And I think you, at some point in the game, you still can go into people's houses and break stuff. But it's kind of the game addressing itself and being like, okay, do we want a Zelda game to always be a game where you go into someone's houses and break all their stuff? Well, no. How do we stop it? Well, at the first chance people get to do that, let's have it be a very negative consequence. And then suddenly people are playing the game differently now. I don't break pots as often in Wind Waker as I do in Ocarina of Time, that's for sure.
Sure.
And then in Skyward Sword, when you go into somebody else's house and you try and go through all their stuff, open their dresser and their closet, and Link is always like, I shouldn't do this. And he, like, doesn't, he's like, I shouldn't look. And you go into Zelda's wardrobe, and it's like, I shouldn't look. And it's so funny. But at that same time, I all of a sudden, throughout the rest of the game, I'm not going through stuff in other people's houses now. And it's like, okay, well, that's the Zelda game director people are, funneling me in a direction that's a little more realistic. And it just takes some negative feedback at the beginning of a game to get me to play it differently throughout.
Yeah. No, actually, that brings me to a question, Emily. Do you see a need? I feel like video games exaggerate things oftentimes to make fail states very clear and obvious to the player. Conversations can be so subtle sometimes and nuanced. I feel like oftentimes you'll play a game where it's very obvious this person's mad at you. Now, like I keep thinking of Oblivion when you try and go through the conversation system in Oblivion, and it's very obvious when something hasn't worked out in your conversation. Is that I don't know. What are the pitfalls with having more nuanced results from a system like this, where a player maybe isn't super clear on whether they succeeded with something or not conversationally? Mm-hmm.
Well, so I mean, this is again something that you can kind of ramp up or down on the authoring side. So if you want to heavily telegraph in Conversation Engine, you can, right? So you can write things where people are reacting badly. In the demo that we built for GDC, there's a female character that you're interacting with. She comes up and asks you who you are. If you respond with something that she finds offensive, like if you say like "hi sexy" or something, she will like immediately in the next move like be like, "Oh, okay, you're a barely civilized person," like, and she'll use sort of rude epithets to refer to you when she's responding. So you definitely can be like, the immediate response can be there. I think it's a situation where kind of the duration of the game and the amount of time that the player is spending on individual conversations is going to also affect like how much nuance and how much play you want in there. So if you've got something where it's like, I've got 3 lines of exchange with this character, that's going to need to be very clear. It's going to need to sort of, there's an outcome, it's going to happen quickly, it needs to be completely like well communicated, especially if it's at the beginning of something. But if it's a thing where like I've been playing this game for 60 hours and this character is my best friend and we spend a lot of time together, then you kind of expect that any individual thing that you're doing is not as strongly influencing the relationship anyway, right? Like, because that's just kind of how people work. But I think at that point it becomes okay for the variance to kind of damp down a bit.
So that makes sense.
Yeah.
So going back to AI and its ability to respond procedurally to what a player has told them, how does this change like the writer's art, right? Because you're not writing the words that the NPC says like games do now or traditionally do. With a lot of games today that are, say, really, really long and they have lots and lots of conversations with hundreds of different characters, they have learned from, say, Mass Effect 1, where they repeated the same animations. That's like you see the same movements from the characters between different characters using the same motions with their hands, to say something like The Witcher 3, where they've learned how to blend different parts of the animation so seamlessly that you almost never see the same animation twice. I had a point. I was going somewhere with it. Basically, what I'm asking is, when the computer is choosing, because we're kind of talking about that too with voice acting, right? Like that's kind of the direction that you'd have a voice actor come in. They'd give a sample or a bunch of samples of different lines, but the computer would then take that and then have their own words that they're speaking, but use the inflection and the emotionality like you're talking about. We're making strides there. But for the writer of the story, I mean, like, what is their job now? I guess, like, what
does it mean to write for this is what you're asking.
Yes, essentially.
So I mean, first of all, okay. Let me back up. It's not the case that you are not writing anything that is spoken by the characters, right? Like everything that is spoken by characters is either pieced together from elements that somebody wrote or pieced together from libraries that were brought into the project, right? So somebody has specified, like, here are various insults that characters in this game world can use. And, maybe these ones are sort of crude, and so only a crude character would use them. And these ones are like sort of snide and elitist, and so only like an aristocrat would use these insults. So, there's sort of choices about what the world's culture is, what the world, kind of how the world building works that are implied in making those decisions. But as an author, you're still thinking through, all right, here's my scene. what is the, as I was saying earlier, like how can the scene end? What are the key pieces that need to be communicated in this scene? And then it's up to you basically how much you want to allow in the system variance aspects. So if you wanted to, you could use Character Engine and not let it vary the dialogue very much at all and have that be very controlled, but make use of its other features primarily around sort of interpreting natural language and that kind of thing. Or you can really go to town with the procedurality and say, I've got these sort of pieces that get plugged in whenever a character likes or dislikes me, and then it's going to go and do a whole bunch of choice making from its selection of possible ways to express that, and pick what it wants to do. So there's kind of a spectrum of how much do you want to hand roll individual wording and how much do you want to leave that open to the system. And what I find in writing for this myself is that sometimes sort of key moments of key scenes, I want to allow less variation, or I want to write multiple variants, but I want to kind of, put some care into them as the author. But then in other places, whether it's, things where a character is answering a player's question about things from the knowledge model, or something where a character is responding to a social situation that might arise many, many times, that's something where I want to let it be a little bit more fluid. So the way that I kind of think about this from an authoring perspective is you're laying down this structure, you're perhaps controlling the critical moments of delivery, but then you're leaving the rest to the system to improvise a little bit. And it's like you've got a musical score where whoever is playing that instrument is going to riff a bit, but it's still your piece underneath.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you're saying that in critical moments or key moments of the story, the writer would still have the dialogue they wrote.
You have the option to do that. You have the option to vary or not vary as you wish.
As much as you want. So there's a big spectrum there. That makes sense. So then if the player says something that's way off the cuff or something non-expected, then the procedural generation would come in and how to respond. But when they get back to the topic at hand and he's going to explain the lore of the story or whatever, that could be a set in stone written piece of content that the writer did. That's awesome. Okay. Thank you for answering our questions. We have a couple of others from our audience that we'd like to turn to you now. Chris Guin is the first one. He wrote this. I think about games like Fable that promised more freedom with respect to how you could interact with the world's NPCs, but once I felt like I had figured out the NPC system or how the different attributes impacted the character responses, I immediately became bored. Part of the appeal of narrative games, at least for me, is getting to experience a constant infusion of new content. Taking character interaction out of the pure writing space and into the AI space seems to risk making something that could be content and then making it into mechanics. And once mechanics are learned, there's still potential enjoyment from mastering them, but the discovery or novelty element is greatly lessened. Have you come up with any cool ways to make sure that mechanics of the AI are opaque to the player? And also, what are ways you have seen or have come up with for writers to make sure that AI characters are still fun to explore and discover and represent fresh, new content?
Right. So part of this, I think, some of this we've, in a sense, already touched on in things that I've talked about earlier. But I think it is a really good point. What I'm going for personally, and I think a lot of the people who are interested in using the system are also going for, is not something where we're just handing off interaction with characters to a mechanical system, but it's instead that the mechanics are enriching the interaction with the content. So I might just, for an example, like if I've got a scene where this character is going to insult me, then as an author, I might write, that moment of like, I've authorially decided I want them to insult me, but I'm going to mark that was an insult, and then I'm going to hand off to the AI system the ability to interpret the player's response to insult, and sort of tell, like, did the player take offense? Did the player like turn out to be too wimpy to react to that? Like, what are, kind of how did you respond, and how is that going to procedurally change the character's response to the player? Those kinds of things. So, so the aim is to sort of have the mechanics let the player, as we were saying earlier, be more expressive, have more intentionality. And this is something I think about a lot. The sort of in player agency, the difference between perceivable consequence and intentionality. It's easy to get perceivable consequence in existing dialogue trees because you can see like, oh, I said this thing that was rude, and then the character is mad at me, and that's easy enough. But intentionality is a lot harder to get in a lot of the sort of the current types of structures because you don't know what dialogue options you're going to be offered, and in particular, it's hard to set up any kind of multi-chain plans. Like at most, you could be like, oh, I'm going to take a decision to just always be rude to this character and see what happens, and you can do that. But the sort of more subtle things of I'm going to try and make this character nervous and then see if that makes it easier to get information out of them, right? Like that kind of planning is just not possible with the current systems because the mechanics underlying content are not there, right? So the aim here is like, can we put some of those mechanics into a scene where the actual content of that scene might be completely unique to that piece of the game, and there's like what you're achieving by maneuvering the NPC that way is brand new. So there's that kind of excitement of discovery, but it's paired with the player experience of actually being able to form and execute a plan, or if your plan fails, to have it fail for a reason that is not the computer didn't understand you, but is like you were actually thwarted somehow or something.
Very interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, the last question comes from Dude McGuy. He asks, have you created any simulations where the player's silence or indecisiveness can be considered an actual input in the conversation that changes the AI character behavior? Some games have an NPC give a scripted response like, is that all? But allow the player to continue the conversation as if there was no awkward silence. In real life, if I start a conversation with someone but can't decide what to say after a while, the other person might get annoyed, puzzled, try to ask me a leading question to keep the conversation going, change the subject entirely, or perhaps just leave. Have you ever programmed an AI character to change the flow of the conversation based on player input of silent or idle?
Yes, several times is the short answer. The longer answer to that is actually the very first piece that I built, Galatea. You're talking to this character, and she part of the point of that interaction is that she's trying to get you to regard her as more human and less like an object. And there are certain points in that conversation where she has more to tell you about a particular topic. So you ask her a question. In the first turn, she'll answer with a certain amount of information. And then if you take another turn where you don't say anything, she'll actually continue talking about what she had been talking about. But it's kind of only if you're patient enough as a player to elicit that are you even going to ever see that content. So there it wasn't so much the NPC is mad at you for not saying anything. It's the NPC wants to be listened to, but you're conditioned as a player probably not to listen. So that's kind of an extreme example. Another semi-extreme example is a piece that I did, which was quite a short piece, which was basically a comedic retelling of Cinderella. And in Cinderella, like in the Grimm version, I don't think this comes in Disney, but in the Grimm version, like there are these sinister birds that peck out the eyes of the stepsisters, and it's quite creepy. So I the premise of this retelling is that you are actually a parrot on a perch, like looking on as the prince comes to visit Cinderella's family. which explains like why you can kind of only blurt out single words. It didn't really have like full natural language understanding. You could type keywords, but because you're a parrot, like just blurting out weird words is fine. So what happens is like the NPCs keep talking to each other about like, oh, you've come to try these shoes on the sisters, like how nice, you know, one of them might be the person you're looking for. And they're having this conversation, which will continue to go on. But when you inject words into the conversation, then they respond to the topic. They're like, oh, you know, like this topic has just been brought up. And so they'll talk about that and then kind of revert to their flow. But if you don't say anything, they'll just progress by themselves. So that's another example. But there's a lot of kind of space with this. Versu actually let you, as a player, kind of decide when you wanted to take action at all. So you could kind of keep just waiting and not even get your kind of menu screen, but just like wait while the NPCs interacted with each other, and then decide like, okay, at this moment, I've decided I want to say something, and I'm going to bring up my list of options. And unless it was some sort of critical moment in the story where you had to decide something, you could just sort of sit through a dinner party with your mouth shut if you wanted to. People might comment that you were being kind of silent, but that was an option. So I think a lot of the sort of interest value of that depends on what the social stakes of the silence might be. And then the actual design decisions around it vary a lot depending on whether we're talking about real-time interaction or turn-based interaction. Because obviously, like, if you intentionally take a turn of silence, that is a bit different from being silent in a real-time interaction where it has to decide at a certain point, oh, too long has elapsed and now it's become awkward and I need to prompt you or something. And the thing to be cautious about in the latter case is that there are a lot of reasons why people stop giving input to their games that are not necessarily intentional, right? Like if something happens, like I've got a toddler and they do something stupid and I need to suddenly walk away from my console, that wasn't an intentional input. It was just, you know. So there are kind of design considerations about that where you want to keep that sense of I'm still in conversation with the game in an interesting way, and that might be translating to conversation with the character. But I don't want to penalize players for like having a real life that sometimes interacts with them either. And you can kind of frustrate players if you're not careful around that. But different platforms have different kind of affordances around this too. So in VR, for instance, where you've got a strong sense of the immediate presence of the character and most other distractions blocked out, it's a lot more natural to have a real-time responsiveness from the character, and responsiveness to other things too, like gesture proximity. Like we did an example, little demo with the same robot character in Character Engine put into VR, where she would feel more threatened if you got too close to her. So there's kind of like an extra piece there.
That's awesome.
Jeez. This is gonna change the way people speedrun games. Like, how quickly can you get the information you need? Do you not talk? Do you stand closer? Do you just kind of let them run through it? Do you like demand certain things?
I think there's room for.
Well, and then 10 years in the future, someone's gonna find out. Oh, if you just do this, then you can go even faster. Yeah, that'd be crazy.
What were you gonna say, Emily?
Oh, just it opens up new realms of possibility for Twitch, I think. But yeah,
certainly, certainly. Well, that is the end of our topics for today. Did either you or Kason or Landon have anything else you wanted to add or ask before we wrap up, or anything like that?
No, not right now. No. Well, the only thing that I can think of, and we sort of addressed it, is with this upcoming, because a lot of things that happen in games tech-wise, it's not. Like the PC space is driving things for sure, but consoles are still where a vast majority of people have their gaming experience. And what would you like to see in the upcoming console generation that would make your life easier with this kind of stuff? Are you concerned with GPU being a bottleneck, or is it CPU that's a bottleneck?
Well, so there are things that can be sped up with GPU, but most of what we're doing actually is not, unless we layered on quite a bit more to what the natural language piece is doing than we're currently doing. It would not be significantly accelerated by GPU. So it's probably more a CPU kind of thing. But I think gosh.
I know built-in
Yeah, I mean, a lot of
microphones like Microsoft with the Kinect, for a while, everyone who bought one had that, kind of means interacting. You know that was their intention.
Yeah.
I don't know if they're going to have that be a default thing that people just have moving forward. And I don't know if that's a hurdle for a game that would rely so heavily on something like this.
Yeah, I mean, certainly for something that's natural language based, specifically for something that's speech based, you want your microphones to be as good as possible, and ideally, I mean, it might be a case of headsets or something, because proximity, like you've got something next to the player's mouth, you're going to be clearer. Basically, all of the things that you can do to make sure that you're reading that speech as accurately as possible, because it gets really annoying if they keep misunderstanding you. So that's but and that's an area where you kind of you want to make sure that you're not making assumptions about your audience that will backfire. Like, the same issues that arose with sort of video accuracy in the Kinect, like people from different backgrounds might have different accents or pitches of speech, and that comes in. So that comes in on the speech to text side, but it also comes in. This actually kind of gets a little off the console question, but into something else which is quite interesting, which is there's also some interesting tech becoming available now about using cameras to detect the emotionality of the player. So like, what is your expression? Like, do you seem to be happy or angry or whatever, which is interesting and could easily be used as an input for our system, because you can have inputs like that are emotional or gestural. But again, like, it's really important to not forget about cultural differences there, because like different cultures, people express emotion with different sort of degrees of emphasis. And so there's been some really interesting sort of studies comparing reading facial expressions from people from Greece versus people from Sweden, and they were quite different. So, if you're trying to build a system around those things, there are pitfalls if you don't sort of think about the global aspect.
So that increases the workload for the localization team then on that side.
All of this is stuff that can eventually be resolved, I think, and potentially even in a way that doesn't require sifting through on a game by game basis. I mean, I suspect that we will get to a point at some point where a lot of these things, a lot of this is just, do we have enough data to model all of the different variances that we need to account for? And then once that data is collected, using the techniques of machine learning in different ways to account for that. But, a lot of the machine learning training challenges are just around like, okay, like we can get a lot of examples of white middle-class Americans doing this, but, does that cover everything we need to cover?
Yeah,
that makes sense.
So it's just a matter of time, collecting lots of data, feeding that data to the machine.
and trying not to be. Yeah.
No, go ahead and say your thing first.
I just the other side about data collection is trying not to be too sinister and big brotherly about it either, because see also Facebook, right? So we need to be careful what we're doing.
A lot of trouble for what they've been doing. I was going to say, I think that would also underscore the need for going to what we talked about like an hour ago. Probably the preference to have an internet connection and a cloud base for a lot of this stuff. So it doesn't necessarily have to be on the system or on the console or on the disk, but that you're accessing something that other games are simultaneously also accessing, just in different parts, and they're pulling different things, but it's all in one central place. But it's got to be like via online. And I think that would also take a lot off of the localization team if you can kind of get all that data into one place.
Yeah.
True. Very true. All right. Well, this is actually something I forgot to ask you about beforehand. Usually we have other YouTubers on on our podcast, so they usually want us,
right.
plug their channel or their social media or whatever. Do you even want people to come and follow you somewhere, or a blog, or how can people play Galatea, or how would you like people to follow?
Sure. Okay. So I am Emma Short on Twitter. I've got emmashort.blog, which is my blog where I post about interactive fiction, interactive narrative, and AI topics. There's a lot of different stuff up there. And then if you're interested in character engines specifically, spiritai.com has that more information about the tooling. And Spirit AI also has the Spirit AI on Twitter. So when we, as a company, post about what we're doing, or sometimes we have company blog posts about different topics, that's where that would go.
Okay, great.
Cool.
If you wouldn't mind, send me all those links. I'll make sure I get them in the description.
Yeah,
so if anybody wants to go to one of those links, they'll be in the video description. If you are listening to our podcast on the audio only side, you can find the video on YouTube. Just search Dark Pixel Gaming. That's our YouTube channel. You can watch it there. And until next time, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your support. Thank you, Emily, for coming on and talking to us about this very fascinating topic, something that I am really hoping to see be implemented more into the larger landscape of larger games in the next 10, 15, 20 years, whatever it is. So thank you. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
All right, guys. We'll see you again next week. Peace out. Have a good day.
Peace.
Bye.